Here's what's coming up on The World Today. Israel criticizes UN Secretary General over comments concerning the war and revokes visas of UN humanitarian chief and other UN staff. Hundreds protest the abduction of children from Israel by Hamas militants. Plus, Liberia presidential election head to a runoff. It's 5 p.m. here in Nigeria. A warm welcome to the program today. I'm Millicent Walker. We begin with reactions to events at the UN Security Council meeting, which held Tuesday evening. UN Chief Antonio Guterres had pleaded for civilians to be protected in the war between Israel and Hamas, voicing concern about clear violations of international humanitarian law in the Gaza Strip. He told the 15-member UN Security Council that at a crucial moment like this, it was vital to be clear that war has rules, starting with the fundamental principle of respecting and protecting civilians. Israel took offense with the comments and announced it was denying visas to top UN officials to send a message after the remarks. Top Israeli diplomats have been calling for Mr. Guterres' resignation. Just a while ago, Mr. Guterres said he was shocked by misrepresentations of his comments in the Security Council. He said his comments were not justifying acts of terror by Hamas, and he condemned the horrifying acts of terror by Hamas in Israel. He also spoke of the grievances of the Palestinian people, but said they cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas. He says it was necessary to set the record straight out of respect to victims and their families. We'll have more on this in a bit.
I am shocked by the misrepresentations by some of my statement yesterday in the Security Council, as if I was justifying acts of terror by Hamas. This is false. It was the opposite. In the beginning of my intervention yesterday, I clearly stated, and I quote, "I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented 7 October acts of terror by Hamas in Israel. Nothing can justify the deliberate killing, injuring and kidnapping of civilians or the launching of rockets against civilian targets." End quote. Indeed, I spoke of the grievances of the Palestinian people. And in doing so, I also clearly stated, and I quote, "But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas," end quote. And then I went on with my intervention, referring all my positions on all aspects of the Middle East crisis. I believe it was necessary to set the record straight, especially out of respect to the victims and to their families.
In the meantime, Israel has released footage of targets said to be used by Hamas militants being struck by missiles. The Israeli army explained in a Telegram message that the strikes were carried out on Tuesday at infrastructure belonging to Hamas, such as tunnel shafts, military headquarters, weapons warehouses, as well as equipment like mortar launchers and anti-tank missile launchers had been destroyed. Some of the targets destroyed had been creating blockades that prevented Gazans from evacuating to southern Gaza. And if we look across the border to Gaza, death and destruction characterize the images seen. Rescuers continue to pull people out of rubble as the Israeli military intensified the bombing of southern Gaza overnight. At one of the sites, the rescue team reassured a father trapped under the rubble in the hours of this morning before they managed to pull him and a young girl out. More than 700 Palestinians, including more than 300 children, were killed on Tuesday. Well, as for the Israeli military, they continue to accuse Iran of having ordered recent attacks by Tehran-backed militias in Yemen, Iraq and Lebanon. Military spokesman Daniel Hagari said at a press conference that Israel is jointly monitoring the region with its U.S. ally. He also said Iran was currently providing Hamas in Gaza with intelligence and was helping steal anti-Israel sentiment globally with an online messaging campaign.
a proxy.
Let's bring you more on our lead story now. The row in the UN Security Council over Secretary General Antonio Guterres' comment on Israel. Tuesday, the United Nations Security Council held its first open debate on the Israel-Gaza war, with most members calling for an immediate ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid to reach Palestinians under relentless Israeli bombardments in Gaza. The 15-member council, where the 5 permanent members, including the US and Russia, have a veto, has so far failed to deliver a resolution that would end the violence.
Calling for an immediate ceasefire, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that no party to an armed conflict is above international humanitarian law. He also said the Hamas attack on October 7 did not happen in a vacuum.
The war in Gaza is raging and risks spiraling throughout the region. Divisions are splintering societies, tensions threaten to boil over. At a crucial moment like this, it is vital to be clear on principles, starting with the fundamental principle of respecting and protecting civilians. I am deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza. Let me be clear, no party to an armed conflict is above international humanitarian law.
The comments by the UN chief drew an angry response from the Israeli foreign minister. In his speech, the Palestinian foreign minister called for justice from the international community.
Mr. Secretary General, the UN was established to prevent atrocities, to prevent such atrocities like the barbaric atrocities that Hamas committed. But the UN is failing. The UN is failing, and you, Mr. Secretary General, have lost all morality and impartiality. Because when you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And by tolerating terrorism, you are justifying terrorism. Hamas, as the minister explained, beheaded babies, burned families, raped women, abducted kids, babies, Holocaust survivors. And the SG is blaming the victim? You are blaming Israel? This is a pure blood libel. This is a pure blood libel, and I think that the Secretary General must resign. Because from now on, every day that he is here in this building, unless he apologizes immediately, today we called him to apologize, there's no justification to the existence of this building.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken reiterated that every country has the right to defend itself. Blinken also called on United Nations member states to urge Iran not to become directly involved in the Israel-Hamas war.
We're all determined to prevent this conflict from spreading. To that end, we call on all member states to send a firm, united message to any state or non-state actor that is considering opening another front in this conflict against Israel, or who may target Israel's partners, including the United States. Don't throw fuel on the fire. Members of this council, and permanent members in particular, have a special responsibility to prevent this conflict from spreading.
In response, Iran blames the United States for exacerbating the conflict.
Today, the U.S. Secretary of State once again attempts to wrongly place the blame on Iran. Iran categorically rejects these groundless allegations. Our commitment to the regional peace and stability remains unwavering. Iran aligned with the international community in endorsing the call for an immediate ceasefire and a cessation of Israeli relentless military aggression, as well as imperative to halt the forced displacement of over 1 million people from Gaza. The United States' unwavering support for the occupation and aggression has rendered it an active part of the problem. The U.S. has further exacerbated the conflict by overtly aligning itself with the aggressor at the expense of the innocent Palestinian population.
There's been fears the conflict between Israel and Iran-backed Palestinian Hamas militants could spill over into a wider war, drawing in Lebanon's heavily armed Hezbollah that is also supported by Tehran.
Well, that was the first UN Security Council debate on the Israel-Hamas conflict. But staying with that meeting Tuesday was New Zealand present at the meeting, which called for the release of hostages taken by Hamas and for Israel to provide basic needs for civilians in Gaza. New Zealand's ambassador to the UN, Caroline Schwalger, condemned Hamas's attack on Israel, but says Israel needs to provide basic needs to Gazans under the Fourth Geneva Convention.
It is intolerable to see civilians continue to suffer disproportionately as innocent victims of this conflict. New Zealand condemns absolutely Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel. We are appalled by their brutality, their targeting of civilians, and the taking of hostages, which are clear violations of international law. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We support Israel's right to defend itself in full compliance with international law, including in respect of actions taken in Gaza. New Zealand joins calls for a humanitarian pause to provide neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian organisations an opportunity to provide assistance and protection to those in Gaza who desperately need it. We expect Israel and Hamas to act in accordance with international humanitarian law, which imposes obligations upon all parties engaged in armed conflict. Israel also has an obligation under international humanitarian law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, to provide basic needs for civilians in Gaza, including food, water, energy, and shelter, and to facilitate humanitarian aid.
Israel has continued documenting its attacks against Hamas. It released this video earlier today showing forces stopping a sea attack attempt by Hamas. The video showed people in the sea being shot at, which the IDF says was filmed close to the area, and airstrikes on buildings in Gaza they aid were used to launch the attack and store weapons. The IDF says at least 2 people were involved in the attempted infiltration via a tunnel shaft located on the coast of the Gaza Strip. Joining me right now, Foreign Affairs commentator Adam Roosevelt. He joins us from Dubai. Adam, it's great to see you, especially after your wedding. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you. And, you know, we hope this conflict comes to a point of neutrality, but definitely good to be with you and the viewers.
Yes, indeed. A pleasure. As a veteran U.S. officer, what goes through your mind when you see these videos being released by Israel showing its attacks on Gaza?
Well, I can first say that I have seen a number of videos coming from both sides, particularly to answer your question, how I feel seeing the strikes. I understand the objective militarily, but I think from a civilian perspective, it's very difficult to see the kind of carnage back and forth from these type of attacks. Again, the military objective is to eradicate Hamas, but I think now that we are seeing the reality of war, I think that it's very difficult for the civilians globally to digest this level of, you know, carrying out military operations. And I think it's very difficult for the globe, which is now causing us to call for ceasefires, if you will.
Some may say that does this have to do with accountability, or is it a boastful move by the Israeli army to boost the morale of its citizens in one way, or perhaps its military personnel and reservists that have been called back to fight this war?
Well, I can tell you that I have been in conversation with government officials on the side of Israeli just to get an understanding about what is the objective. And I think given the brutality of the attack, their objective, based on what I'm hearing from the officials, is that they need to move strong. They need to make sure they establish confidence amongst the Israeli population. We know that These attacks have been very heinous, but they need to have the kind of support from the Israeli population if they're going to continue this war effort forward. And this shows that they are willing and ready to go as far as necessary to protect their sovereignty. And that is really their objective. And they're using this campaign to instill confidence in the population across Israel.
Leaders across have been calling for a ceasefire for humanitarian purposes. Israel is refusing to even consider it. When it comes to war strategy, should they think about a ceasefire, especially to allow humanitarian aid reach those in need?
Well, I'll say this. Now that it's a full-blown military operation, ceasefire, it is very difficult to enter into at this moment. Right now, the international community will call for that, but the Israeli Defense Forces will carry out the objective of eliminating Hamas at all costs. If they call for the ceasefire from a military perspective, they will be allowing for Hamas to remain in Gaza. And effectively, that means that they could rebuild their forces in the future and carry out a similar attack, but probably with more lethality in the future. So now this military operation is to eradicate, disrupt, and destroy Hamas. And effectively, there will be casualties, but they're on a full-blown military operation. Now we need to call for what I call red zones, green zones, and yellow zones to allow for humanitarian conversations to take place.
But one also wonders, with all of this bombardment, what happens to those that have been captured by Hamas?
Yeah. Well, I think we've seen some new developments with the release of several prisoners, which is a positive step forward. But I think we're going to need a lot more steps forward. I am personally receiving lists with children from the 9 months to 1 year old, 3-year-olds, up to 9 to 12. And it's very sad to see these names on these lists that are in custody right now with Hamas. There are a lot of efforts going on to negotiate through back channels with the Palestinian leadership as well as Hamas directly, but it's going to be a very difficult time. I think there's a priority of release, which is Americans, and then there will be other special groups like elderly and so forth before we start to see a larger group of release of hostages.
I want to talk about what happened last night at the UN Security Council. Secretary General Antonio Guterres had made an appeal to Israel once again for humanitarian aid into Gaza, which resulted in UN officials being persona non grata in Israel and criticism of his comments. What do you think was happening in the room?
Generally speaking, at the political level, less is more. And at this point, these type of statements are being scrutinized for every single word and sentence, because each of these statements mean more than what probably the public consumption understands. And when the statement was made from the United Nations Security Council Secretary General, this was not done in a vacuum. It leaves a lot of room for open interpretation. You've put out and seen the Israeli ambassador come out with sharp comments about how he feels, now calling for the resignation of the Secretary General if he doesn't apologize. They are at a state of emotion that is very difficult, and they're not looking for the United Nations to downplay or dilute the reality, and you will see some tension in terms of strategic communication if there is not aggressive language that is in favor of one or other side of the issue.
Another thing I've often wondered about the United Nations' role in this war is hard to sit on the fence, especially as Israel has been appealed upon for years regarding Palestine. What should the United Nations do now?
I think the United Nations must call for humanitarian corridors, and that we need to get very strategic about how we execute the plan for that. And that's why I'm calling for green zones, yellow zones, and red zones, which are designated locations that we can move certain hostages in negotiation with Hamas. These are new ways to tactically negotiate with Hamas to make sure we can get this humanitarian corridor open and get them out to neighboring states like Jordan and Egypt. And this is going to be important, but the UN must stand strong to be a mediator, but they cannot take sides. They need to advocate for Palestinians. They need to advocate for anti-terrorism, They need to advocate for peace and security. These are the major priorities, and the UN must stand by their mandate, which is global peace and security, but do not leave the Palestinians out of the conversation.
We'll continue to monitor the situation and hope for a much better outcome. Foreign Affairs commentator Adam Roosevelt, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Thank you so much. Stay well.
You as well. We go over to Turkey's President Recep Erdogan. He has described Israel's attacks on Gaza as mental illness and has called for a ceasefire. He was addressing members of his AK party when he accused Western powers of fraud, saying countries who say Israel has a right to defend itself should also condemn the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza. He called on all countries to avoid provoking further conflict and not approach it as a conflict between Christianity and Islam. Turkey already supports Palestine, backs a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and hosts members of Hamas. It has toughened its stance against Israel as fighting and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza intensifies. The Hamas government in Gaza wants Israel to halt its assault on the Strip. Hamas official Osama Hamdan, addressing a press conference on Tuesday, says Israel is committing crimes of occupation and executing a genocidal war. He called on Arab and Islamic countries and the United Nations to take political and moral responsibility and take concrete actions to end the aggression and crimes and massacres which violate norms and international law. He also called for an end of normalization with the occupiers and for the expulsion of the Israeli ambassadors in Arab and Muslim nations, and for the opening of a permanent humanitarian crossing, allowing enough fuel to reach hospitals, bakeries, and water pumps, and food and medical supplies, and also medicine. All still to come on the program. One Gaza couple recounts the sadness of not having their big day because of the war against Hamas. You stay with us. Welcome back. The head of Lebanon's Hezbollah has met with top leaders of Hamas, saying they had assessed what their alliance must do to achieve a real victory for the resistance in Gaza. The meeting grouped Hezbollah's Saeed Hassan Nasrallah with Hamas's deputy chief Saleh al-Ouri and Islamic Jihad chief Zaid al-Nakala. State media says the meeting assessed the positions taken internationally and what the axis of resistance must do. French President Emmanuel Macron is still in the Middle East. Earlier today, he met with Jordan's King Abdullah II in Amman after a visit to Israel and the West Bank. He met the king in an effort to prevent regional escalation of the war between Israel and Hamas on Tuesday. The French president had proposed from Jerusalem that the US-led coalition of dozens of countries fighting Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria should include the fight against the Palestinian militant group Hamas in Gaza. A while ago, he arrived in Egypt and met with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And the British Royal Air Force plane carrying humanitarian aid for Gaza has taken off from Iraq Rise Norton in Oxfordshire, headed for Egypt. It comes as various world leaders call for a pause on fighting between Israel and Hamas to allow aid into Gaza, where people are living in harrowing conditions. Religious leaders such as Pope Francis have added their voice to calls for release of hostages by Hamas and for Israel to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. During his weekly address today, Pope Francis said he is always thinking about the situation between Israel and Palestine and made his call on behalf of the hostages and people suffering in Gaza. The Pope plans to lead a special prayer for peace in St. Peter's Basilica in what he said last week would be a day of fasting, prayers, and penance. Well, back in Israel, focus has turned to innocent children and teenagers who have been abducted by Hamas militants in Gaza. Earlier today, huge teddy bears blindfolded and smeared with red paint triggered heartbreak and tears amongst bypassers in a square in central Tel Aviv. Photos of abducted children were attached to each teddy bear, ranging from babies to teenagers, and a call for their immediate return.
It highlights every day that we're going through. Our hearts are breaking for the parents. We've been through this too many times. And our hearts break when the rest of the world just doesn't realize. And I'm very sorry for anybody that wasn't a part, hefni pesha, as you would say in Hebrew, that wasn't part of the Hamas or wasn't part. But we didn't start this.
Very bad to see the young children. I don't believe it. I don't believe it, really. It's animals, people. How we can do it? To kill child, parents. What can I tell you? I see that and I feel I want to cry.
We need the world to be by us right now. We need the world to support us, to defend ourselves. We need the world to know the truth, and this is the truth, is that there are innocent kids, babies, adults, women that did nothing wrong, that got slaughtered that Saturday and are still feeling unsafe. Everyone here feels unsafe where we are in our homes, even in Tel Aviv.
Well, amidst the war going on between Israel and Hamas, even love has to be shelved. And that is the story of Ahmed and Suwa, who had looked forward to the day when they become man and wife. That day seems very uncertain now.
The date for the festivities was October 19, and Ahmed and Suwa had been looking forward to finally tying the knot. It was supposed to be the happiest day for their respective families as well. Now that dream may never be realized. Their hopes have been dashed by the war between Israel and Hamas.
كشاب عمره 30 سنة ومستني الفرحة هذا واليوم هذا طبعا فارغ الصبر.
As a 30-year-old man, I was impatiently waiting for this wedding and for this day. The 19th of October transformed from a joyful day to a catastrophe full of sadness, destruction and deaths and body parts, to the ceiling collapsing and displaced people. My fiancée came from the north, from Beit Lahi to Khan Yunis in the south. Her family, all her family, and also a lot of other families were displaced.
A resident of Khan Yunis in the south of Gaza Strip, Ahmed arranged cabs to go and pick up Suwar and her family from Beit Lahi on the opposite side of the enclave.
Unfortunately, we ended up being displaced to the refugee camps instead of getting married to my fiancé in a white dress. I went to the refugee camp and it became a sad day for me. It destroyed me emotionally and I started crying. It was meant to be my wedding day. Everyone was telling me it's okay and to have faith. This is our destiny and we have to accept it. I don't know what to say. The occupation destroyed everything we ever hoped for, dreamt for, and took a lot away.
I called my fiancée and my family up north, whom I brought here, and my siblings. In that moment, I couldn't control myself because the strikes were more intense up north. The displaced was more intense up north. In that moment, we had to look for a car because we wanted to bring them here with me to the north. Even when we finally managed to get a car to get them here, airstrikes happened while they were fleeing. They bombed the entire trailer with an F-16. Body parts started scattering in front of Suwa, who was screaming and got scared.
Israel has told everybody living in the northern half of the 45-kilometer-long Gaza Strip to move south, but the strikes have flattened districts throughout the enclave. More than 1.4 million people fled their homes for temporary shelters under Israel's heaviest ever bombardment. Palestinian authorities say nearly 5,800 people have been killed by Israeli and artillery strikes that followed the October 7 attacks by Hamas militants who stormed Israel, killing more than 1,400 people and grabbing more than 200 hostages.
And we're back to talking to victims of the attack by Hamas on Israel. 45-year-old real estate agent, and this is Yoshi Schneider. He did not realize his family was in danger until he turned on the news. His cousin Cher and her two children, 9-month-old Kfir and 4-year-old Ariel, who live in kibbutz near Oz, were abducted by Hamas militants October the 7th. It turns out Cherie and her whole family, including her husband, Yarden, were abducted that day. And eyes have turned to U.S. President Joe Biden to return jail Wall Street Journal reporter who is being held in Russia, Evan Gershkovich. His sister, Danielle, said this much on the issue to a reporter in an interview. Earlier this month, a Russian court dismissed a complaint against the extension of Gershkovich's pre-trial detention more than 6 months after his arrest on spying charges, which he denies. The decision essentially means that he will remain in detention. No date has been set for his trial.
Unfortunately, the case is pretty opaque. So I have to take it day by day. But we rely on President Biden's promise to our family that he's going to get Evan home. So we just have to put our faith in that, and we're doing all that we can on our end to keep the focus on Evan in the news. I would guess that it would be most likely a prisoner swap, but I'm not the most qualified to say. I hope it's something else. I hope whatever it takes that we get Evan home sooner. It's very difficult because cases like this in Russia are kept opaque. For Evan's sake, we just need to continue to just trust that the government is doing everything they can. So it's been about a year since we were all together. So it's just a reminder that he's already missed so much. He's missed friends' weddings. He's missed family vacations, and he'll be missing the holidays that are coming up. He's actually going to be spending his 32nd birthday in prison on October 26th. I can't imagine what it's like for him to be spending his birthday there, but we wrote some really sappy, sweet birthday letters to him. So I'm hoping he gets them on the day, and it's a little bright spot on that day. Just a horrible marker that he's every day is a day too long.
Well, staying with the situation with the war in Ukraine, dozens of young Crimean conscripts have been preparing for the start of their active duty in the Russian army after a ceremony at the assembly point in the city of Simferopol in Russian-controlled Crimea. The new recruits were called up during the autumn draft campaign that started after Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree in September for the routine autumn campaign, calling up 130,000 citizens for statutory military service. A total of 2,000 men from Crimea are expected to join the ranks of the Russian army this autumn. Some of them will serve in Crimea, others will be transferred to Russia. Russia seized Crimea in 2014, 8 years before sending tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine. Moscow has a huge concentration of forces on the Black Sea territory. All men in Russia are required to do a year-long military service between the ages of 18 and 27, or equivalent training while in higher education. And the U.S. Congress still does not have a speaker, but Republicans have a nominee, their fourth since October the 3rd, when Kevin McCarthy was forced to resign. Mike Johnson won the party's nomination last night. Republicans' disarray has left lawmakers unable to respond to the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine or take steps to head off a partial government shutdown that will begin November the 18th without congressional action. It is not clear whether Mr. Johnson would be able to overcome divisions that have tripped up three other candidates who had previously won the party's nomination in a sign of those divisions. The second place finisher in the nominating vote was the ousted McCarthy, who secured 43 votes, despite not being a declared candidate.
Democracy is messy sometimes, but it is our system. This conference that you see, this House Republican majority, is united. I'm honored to have the support of my colleagues, and what they understand about this is servant leadership. We're going to serve the people of this country. We're going to restore their faith in this Congress, this institution of government. America is the last best hope of man on the earth. Abraham Lincoln said it. Ronald Reagan used to remind us all the time, and we're here to remind you of that again. We're going to restore your trust in what we do here. You're going to see a new form of government, and we are going to move this quickly. This group here is ready to govern, and we're going to govern well. We're going to do what's right by the people. And I believe the people are going to reward that next year. But we have a lot of big priorities ahead of us right now. The world is on fire. We stand with our ally, Israel.
Still ahead on the program. Lagos opens fourth door return for diasporans to the country in Badagry. We have details when we return. We're still in the United States, where former President Donald Trump and his one-time lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohan, faced off for a second straight day today in a Manhattan courtroom, where the former U.S. president is in the midst of a civil fraud trial over his family's real estate company and business practices. Mr. Cohan, who cut ties with Trump 5 years ago, is expected to undergo more cross-examination by Trump's lawyers determined to undermine his credibility. Cohan testified on Tuesday that Mr. Trump arbitrarily inflated the value of the Trump Organization's real estate assets to secure favorable insurance premiums. Cohan said he doctored financial statements so the property values matched whatever number Mr. Trump told him. The insider testimony could bolster New York Attorney General Letitia James's argument that Trump, his company, and several of its executives unlawfully inflated property values. The case could break up Trump's business empire. Mr. Trump, the frontrunner for the Republican nomination to challenge Democratic President Joe Biden in 2024's U.S. election, has denied wrongdoing and defended the valuations of his properties. Well, in his first court appearance off duty, Alaskan airline pilot Joseph Emerson, accused of trying to disable a jetliner mid-flight, entered a not guilty plea to state charges through his defense attorney as he looked on from behind the court's glass partition. Federal prosecutors on Tuesday charged Emerson, accusing him of trying to shut off the engines of an Alaska Airlines flight on Sunday, October the 22nd, over the Pacific Northwest. He told an officer that he had taken psychedelic mushrooms for the first time and been depressed for the past 6 months and believed he was having a nervous breakdown. Judge Jenna Plank said there was enough cause to proceed with the district attorney's charges.
The motion for preliminary violent felony determination and the supporting affidavit.
Dozens of U.S. states are suing Meta Platforms and its Instagram unit, accusing them of fueling a youth mental health crisis by making their social media platforms addictive. In a complaint filed on Tuesday, the Attorney General of 33 states, including California and New York, said Meta, which also operates Facebook, repeatedly misled the public about the dangers of its platforms and knowingly induced young children and teenagers into addictive and compulsive social media use. Children have long been an appealing demographic for businesses, which hope to attract them as consumers at ages when they may be more impressionable and solidify brand loyalty. For Meta, younger consumers may help secure more advertisers who hope children will keep buying their products as they grow up. And we're now in Africa, where voting was repeated last week in 2 polling stations in northeastern Nimba County, that's in Liberia, after ballots were tampered with by unknown people during the first round of the elections on October the 10th. Well, we've been expecting the total outcome or poll outcome for presidential, senatorial and local representatives votes from the National Elections Commission headquarters in Monrovia. Provisional results show that President George Weah and his main rival, Joseph Boakai, are still running neck and neck, meaning they are set for a runoff. According to provisional results announced last week, Mr. Weah was 43.8% of the vote, while Mr. Boakai was 43.5%. And the Shenzhou 17 crew have conducted extensive trainings and are well prepared to undertake a large number of scientific experiments and technical test tasks for the upcoming space mission. That's according to Chinese astronaut Tang Hongbo, who's also the crew commander. The China Manned Space Agency announced Wednesday that Tang Hongbo, Tang Xingjie, and Jin Xinlin will board the Shenzhou 17 manned spaceship scheduled to be launched at 11:14 Thursday, Beijing time, from the Zhuanshan Satellite Launch Center northwest of China. The 48-year-old Tang and the other two crew members met the press on Wednesday. In 2021, Tang Hongbo flew to space for the first time in the 3-month Shenzhou 12 mission in June 2021, the first crew mission for China's space station construction. And 2 years later, he'll be the first one to return to the space station and also set a new record for the shortest interval between the two spaceflight missions conducted by Chinese astronauts. And the historic town of Badagry hosted the 4th edition of Door of Return Festival, a symbolic annual event where diasporans of African descent were received through the same route that their forefathers were shipped from Africa as slaves to the Western world. Take a look.
Badagry, a coastal town in Lagos State located on the north bank of Porto Novo Creek, shares a border town with the Republic of Benin. From the 16th century till its abolition in 1886, the coastal town of Badagry, now a part of Lagos, was the final point of departure for indigents who were sold into slavery. Today, it has become a destination for tourists who want a slice of its well-preserved ties to the transatlantic slave trade, and the Door of Return launches a new era of cooperation between Africa and its diaspora in the 21st century that brings about the 4th Door of Return Festival, organized by the Office of Nigerians in Diaspora Commission. The diaspora guests walked along a 1.5-kilometer-old slave route to the ocean. Diasporans of Africa are welcomed back through the 4th Door of Return. They're excited to be a part of the historic festival.
What we're doing, we're reversing something that took place amongst the African family over 5 centuries ago.
It is a joy to come back from the African diaspora home that
repeating the way of the slaves and coming back through the door of return. I think it's a very strong symbol that the people who are here today, coming from different countries, from different faiths, they are willing to stay, they are willing to come, to invite others to come, so that we all together are working to raise up and to develop Nigeria, and to raise up and to develop Africa.
The Lagos State Head of Service commends NIGCOM chairman for initiating the program that helps black diasporans trace their roots to Nigeria.
As a people, we have forged ahead and put the dark part of our history behind us. We will continue to forge ahead in dignity, honor, as proud members of the human race.
After the event, the NIGCOM chairman led the delegation to visit Governor Babajide Sanwo-Olu at Lagos House Ikeja and appealed to the government to build a permanent Door of Return in Badagry.
We appeal to you that first thing is, let's have a permanent door to be built in that axis where our people can come and walk through the door. And the work is significant economically, spiritually, physically, and emotionally too.
The governor assures them of promoting cultural heritage.
And we're intentionally trying to develop it, develop the ecosystem that can make Badagry on its own a sustainable city.
The 4th Door of Return will no doubt create opportunities for diasporans to return home and connect with family and friends.
And I hear there was a lot of drumming, singing and dancing for the homecoming. So that's our show this evening. Many thanks for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. Bye for now.